The strategic situation in the Pacific Theater in October 1944 was one of decisive American momentum, a direct consequence of a series of successful offensives that had pushed the Japanese Empire onto the defensive. Following a campaign of island hopping, American forces had secured key bases in the Mariana Islands, including Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. The capture of the Marianas provided the United States Army Air Forces with airfields from which its new long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress, could reach the Japanese home islands. This represented a direct and unprecedented threat to Japan's industrial heartland and its population centers, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus for both sides. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 precipitated the collapse of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government, a clear signal to both the Japanese leadership and the American command of the deteriorating Japanese military position. Concurrently, American submarine warfare had inflicted crippling losses on Japanese merchant shipping, severely restricting the flow of vital raw materials, particularly oil, from the occupied territories in Southeast Asia to the factories and naval bases of Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a dominant force across the Western Pacific, was now constrained by a critical shortage of fuel, which limited its ability to train, conduct operations, and project power. Many of its largest remaining warships were based in Linga Roads, near Singapore, to be closer to the oil supply from the Dutch East Indies, but their operational capacity was hamstrung by this logistical reality. The next logical step in the American advance was the Philippine archipelago. Its recapture was a strategic necessity to sever the Japanese logistical lines to the south and to establish a staging ground for future operations against Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands, and ultimately Japan itself. General Douglas MacArthur, who had vowed to return after his forced evacuation in 1942, strongly advocated for the invasion of the Philippines, arguing for both its strategic value and the moral imperative of liberating the Commonwealth. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, initially favored a direct thrust towards Formosa, believing it to be a more efficient path to blockading Japan. However, after deliberation, the decision was made at the highest levels to proceed with the liberation of the Philippines. The island of Leyte was chosen as the initial point of attack. Its central location and the geography of Leyte Gulf, a large sheltered body of water, made it a suitable objective for establishing a beachhead and logistical base for subsequent operations on other Philippine islands. The operation, codenamed King II, was scheduled for October 20, 1944, and involved a vast assemblage of naval and amphibious forces. The Japanese High Command was fully aware that an American assault on the Philippines was imminent, and they recognized the existential threat it posed. They understood that the loss of the archipelago would fracture their empire, cutting off the home islands from the crucial resources of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese war effort, already reeling from material and fuel shortages, could not survive this strategic amputation. Consequently, the defense of the Philippines was deemed an absolute imperative, a battle upon which the fate of the empire hinged. To this end, the Imperial Japanese Navy activated a pre-existing contingency plan, known as Shogo, or Operation Victory. There were several Show plans for different regions, but Show 1 was specifically for the defense of the Philippines. The plan was audacious and, given the Imperial Navy's weakened state and lack of air power, inherently desperate. It called for a coordinated, multi-pronged naval assault to destroy the American invasion forces at their most vulnerable moment. During the amphibious landing operations, when a vast and relatively slow-moving fleet of transports and support vessels would be concentrated off the landing beaches. The Show 1 plan involved nearly every remaining operational warship in the Japanese fleet, divided into three main forces. The first striking force, under the command of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was the most powerful. It was subdivided into two bodies. Kurita's center force, based at Linga, consisted of 5 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The second striking force, or Southern Force, under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, consisted of 2 battleships, the Fuso and Yamashiro, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. A separate element, the 3rd Striking Force, or 2nd Diversionary Attack Force, under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, with 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, would follow Nishimura from Japanese home waters. The final component was the Northern Force, the Mobile Force, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. This force was unique. Its core was 4 aircraft carriers, Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, and the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. However, these carriers possessed a critical weakness. Due to catastrophic losses of experienced pilots in earlier battles like the Philippine Sea, they embarked only just over 100 aircraft, manned by poorly trained and inexperienced aircrews. Their flight decks were largely empty. Ozawa's force was not intended as a potent striking arm. It was designed explicitly to be a decoy. The overarching concept of Show 1 was for Ozawa's Northern Force to sail south from Japan and lure the main American covering force, the powerful fast carrier task force, away from Leyte Gulf. With the American carriers drawn north, Kurita's center force would transit the San Bernardino Strait, emerge into the Philippine Sea, and descend along the coast of Samar to attack the American landing fleet in Leyte Gulf from the north. Simultaneously, Nishimura's and Shima's southern forces would transit the Surigao Strait to the south of Leyte and attack the American landing fleet from that direction. The plan was a complex pincer movement, relying on precise timing, communication, and the successful deception of the American command. It was a gamble of the highest order, risking the entire remaining surface strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy in one decisive battle, a final throw of the dice to alter the course of a war that was increasingly turning against them. The American forces assembled for the invasion of Leyte were immense, representing the full industrial and military might of the United States projected across the Pacific. The U.S. 7th Fleet, under Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid, was tasked with the amphibious assault. This fleet, often referred to as the MacArthur Navy, was composed of older battleships, cruisers, destroyers, escort carriers, and a vast array of transports and landing craft. Its firepower was substantial, but geared primarily towards shore bombardment and direct support of the troops ashore. Its main surface combatants were 6 battleships, all but one of which were veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, raised, repaired, and modernized. They were slow compared to the newer fleet, but heavily armed and ideal for the line of battle role they would play. Providing air cover for the invasion fleet was a group of 18 escort carriers, small carriers built on merchant hulls, organized into 3 units designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Their aircraft, such as the FM-2 Wildcat and TBM Avenger, were slower and less capable than those on the fleet carriers, and their role was strictly anti-submarine patrol, close air support for the troops on the beach, and local defense. They were not designed to engage major enemy naval units. The real naval power of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was the 3rd Fleet, under the command of the aggressive Admiral William F. Bull Halsey. This fleet centered on Task Force 38, the fast carrier task force, commanded by the veteran and skilled aviator Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. It consisted of 9 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, embarking over 1,000 modern aircraft, screened by a powerful escort of fast new battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Halsey's orders from Admiral Nimitz were to cover and support the landings, but with a crucial and potentially conflicting caveat. In case an opportunity arose to destroy a major portion of the Japanese fleet, that would become the primary task. This dual chain of command, Kinkaid reporting to General MacArthur and Halsey reporting to Admiral Nimitz, and the ambiguity in Halsey's priorities would later prove to be a critical vulnerability in the American command structure during the ensuing battle. The invasion commenced on schedule. On October 20, 1944, American troops began storming the beaches of Leyte. The initial landings met light resistance, and General MacArthur waded ashore, famously announcing his return in a staged radio broadcast. For the next several days, the vast armada of the 7th Fleet remained off the coast, unloading men, vehicles, and thousands of tons of supplies essential for sustaining the campaign inland. The Third Fleet's carriers operated to the north and east of the Philippines, conducting intensive strikes against Japanese airfields on Luzon and elsewhere to suppress enemy air power and prevent interference with the landings. The Japanese initiated Show 1 on October 17th, triggered by preliminary American operations off Leyte. The various naval forces began to move towards their assigned positions, setting the stage for a monumental confrontation. The first significant action occurred on October 23rd in the Palawan Passage, a narrow body of water between Palawan Island and the Spratly Islands. Two American submarines, USS Data and USS Dace, were positioned on patrol along Kurita's anticipated route from Linga to the Sibuyan Sea. At dawn, they sighted the massive center force. Demonstrating exceptional initiative and skill, Data fired a spread of torpedoes that struck Admiral Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Otago. The ship was hit by multiple torpedoes and sank in less than 20 minutes, forcing Kurita to swim for his life and later transfer his command to the battleship Yamato. Minutes later, Data also torpedoed and severely damaged the heavy cruiser Takao, which was forced to retire with two escorting destroyers. Simultaneously, USS Dace torpedoed and sank the heavy cruiser Maya. The battle had not even properly begun, and Kurita had lost 3 of his 10 heavy cruisers, with a 4th crippled, before a single American surface ship or aircraft had engaged him. The submarines had not only inflicted severe damage, but had also provided the first definitive warning to Halsey and Kincaid that a powerful Japanese surface force was approaching from the west. This initial success for the Americans was a severe blow to Japanese morale and a portent of the difficulties they would face in achieving surprise and maintaining cohesion. The following day, October 24th, the main elements of the Japanese fleet came under sustained air attack as they entered the confined waters of the Sibuyan Sea. This engagement became known as the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Search aircraft from Task Force 38 located both Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea and Nishimura's smaller southern force in the Sulu Sea. Halsey, assessing the reports, made a critical decision. Believing that the southern force was the lesser threat and could be handled by Kincaid's 7th Fleet, he directed the air groups from 3 of his 4 carrier groups to concentrate their attacks on Kurita's powerful center force, which posed the most direct danger to the beachhead. Throughout the day, American carrier-based aircraft launched 5 major waves of attacks against Kurita's ships. The primary focus of these attacks was the super battleship Musashi, a sister ship to Yamato and one of the 2 most heavily armed and armored warships ever built. Repeatedly hit by torpedoes and bombs, the massive ship's defenses were overwhelmed. Her anti-aircraft fire was intense, but could not stop the coordinated American assaults. After absorbing an estimated 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits, Musashi, her bow submerged and her speed gone, capsized and sank in the late afternoon, taking over half her crew of nearly 400 men with her. Other ships in the center force were also damaged. The heavy cruiser Myoko was so severely damaged by a torpedo hit that she was forced to withdraw back towards Singapore. Several other cruisers and destroyers sustained lesser damage from near misses and bomb hits. Under this relentless aerial assault, and believing he was facing the entirety of the American carrier force, and with no Japanese land-based air support materializing, Kurita made a temporary decision at approximately 15:30 to reverse course and head west, away from the San Bernardino Strait. This move, interpreted by American pilots as a retreat, was reported to Admiral Halsey. Meanwhile, the southern force under Nishimura continued its steady progress towards the Surigao Strait, largely unmolested by major air attacks, as Halsey had chosen to focus on Kurita. Simultaneously, to the north, Admiral Ozawa's decoy carrier force had finally been located by American scout planes after much effort. Ozawa, to ensure he was seen, launched a small strike of 76 aircraft against the Third Fleet, but these were largely destroyed by American combat air patrols and anti-aircraft fire, inflicting no significant damage. Ozawa then began broadcasting radio messages to ensure the Americans knew his location. The stage was now set for Halsey's most consequential decision. Upon receiving reports that Kurita had turned away and that Ozawa's carriers had been found to the north, Halsey concluded that the center force was no longer a credible threat and that the northern force presented the greatest opportunity to fulfill his directive to destroy a major portion of the Japanese fleet. At 20:00 on October 24th, without informing Admiral Kincaid of the 7th Fleet that he was leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, Halsey made the fateful order for the entire 3rd Fleet, all 3 of his carrier groups and his powerful fast battleship force, which had been tentatively designated as Task Force 34, to steam north at high speed to engage and destroy Ozawa. The door through which Kurita could advance was now wide open. As Halsey moved north with his entire strength, the southern force under Admirals Nishimura and Shima approached the Surigao Strait from the south. Waiting for them at the northern exit of the strait was the 7th Fleet's Bombardment and Fire Support Group, commanded by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf. A meticulous and experienced commander, Oldendorf had prepared a classic naval ambush, one that exploited the narrow geography of the strait to its fullest. He deployed his force across the mouth of the strait in a battle line that echoed the tactics of an earlier era. His 6 old battleships were formed into a line of battle. 5 of them, West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, were Pearl Harbor veterans, now given a chance for vengeance. They were flanked by 8 cruisers positioned to add their firepower. Further down the strait, he positioned 2 lines of PT boats to provide early warning and harass the enemy, followed by several divisions of destroyers poised for torpedo attacks from both flanks of the advancing Japanese. The Battle of Surigao Strait, which commenced just after midnight on October 25th, was a one-sided engagement and a masterclass in naval tactics. The PT boats made first contact, launching torpedoes but scoring no hits, though they provided vital reports on the Japanese approach and composition. As Nishimura's force, consisting of the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Megami, and 4 destroyers, advanced up the narrow strait in a single column, American destroyers launched a series of devastating torpedo attacks from both flanks. The destroyer Fuso was hit by torpedoes, suffered a massive explosion, broke in 2, and sank. 3 of Nishimura's 4 destroyers were sunk or crippled in these attacks. The force was severely disorganized before it even reached the range of Oldendorf's main battle line. When the remaining Japanese ships, led by the battleship Yamashiro, came within range of the American battleships, Oldendorf executed a classic, crossing the T. His ships, arrayed in a line perpendicular to the Japanese approach, could bring all their broadside guns to bear, while the Japanese could only respond with their forward-facing turrets. The American battleships and cruisers opened fire at a range of over 20 (Vuausen yards. The radar-directed gunfire from the American ships, particularly the West Virginia, which had the most modern fire control radar, was devastatingly accurate. Yamashiro was hit repeatedly by shells from multiple battleships. The heavy cruiser Megami was set ablaze and crippled. At approximately 04:19, after being struck by multiple torpedoes from the destroyer attacks and countless shells, Yamashiro capsized and sank. Admiral Nishimura went down with his ship. The crippled Megami and 1 destroyer, Shigura, the sole undamaged major Japanese surface combatant, began to retreat south. It was at this point that Vice Admiral Shima's 2nd Diversionary Attack Force, which had been following Nishimura by several dozen miles, entered the strait. Shima's ships encountered the wreckage of the battle. His flagship, the heavy cruiser Nachi, collided with the burning and drifting Megami, causing further damage to both ships. Assessing the catastrophic defeat of Nishimura's force and believing he was facing an overwhelming and prepared American defense, Shima made the prudent decision to order a retreat. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over. It was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history and a total American victory. Nishimura's force was almost completely annihilated. The southern pincer of the Japanese Showan plan had been decisively broken, and the 7th Fleet had successfully defended its southern flank. While Oldendorf was achieving his victory in Surigao Strait, a far more desperate and unexpected battle was beginning off the coast of Samar. At dawn on October 25th, Admiral Kurita's center force had completed its transit of the San Bernardino Strait. Contrary to Halsey's assumption, Kurita had reversed his temporary withdrawal from the previous afternoon and, under cover of darkness and without any radar contacts to suggest an American presence, had proceeded through the unguarded strait. He emerged into the Philippine Sea and turned south along the coast of Samar, poised to descend upon the virtually undefended landing beaches and transport fleet in Leyte Gulf. The only American forces standing between Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers and the invasion fleet were the 16 escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts of Task Unit 77. 4. 3. Call sign Taffy 3, under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The disparity in force was almost incomprehensible. The Japanese battleships, led by Yamato with its 18-inch guns, outranged and outclassed anything the Americans had. The American escorts had 5-inch guns. The American escort carriers were slow, their thin, unarmored hulls offering little protection. Their primary armament was their aircraft, which were equipped for ground attack with light bombs, depth charges, and rockets, not the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes needed for anti-ship warfare against armored warships. At 06:45, lookouts on Taffy 3 sighted the tall pagoda masts of the Japanese fleet on the northern horizon. Admiral Sprague initially thought it was Halsey's task force, but moments later, the sight of anti-aircraft bursts and shell splashes in colors not used by the US Navy confirmed the worst. They were facing the main Japanese battle fleet. What followed was an engagement of extraordinary heroism, desperation, and confusion. Admiral Sprague immediately turned his task unit east into the wind to launch his aircraft and to seek cover in a nearby rain squall. He sent out a plain language distress call that was picked up by Kincaid and eventually by Halsey far to the north. The battle was a chaotic melee at point-blank range. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts, though vastly outgunned, immediately mounted a furious and near-suicidal attack on the Japanese fleet to buy time for the carriers. The destroyers USS Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts launched relentless torpedo attacks against the Japanese heavy units. They charged directly into the path of the Japanese battleships and cruisers, firing their 5-inch guns and launching torpedoes at point-blank range, making smoke to obscure the retreating carriers. Johnston, though hit repeatedly by shells from battleships and cruisers, continued to fight until it sank, its crew fighting fires and manning whatever weapons remained operational. Hull and Samuel B. Roberts were similarly shattered by overwhelming firepower, but not before inflicting damage and, crucially, disrupting the Japanese formation and diverting their attention. The escort carriers, which their crews sardonically called combustible, vulnerable, expendable, launched and recovered their aircraft continuously. Pilots, often armed with the wrong ordnance, made dry runs to distract Japanese gunners, dropped lightweight bombs that bounced off armored decks, and strafed enemy bridges in exposed positions. Some pilots, out of ammunition, pretended to dive to force Japanese ships to maneuver. The ferocity and sheer audacity of the American response had a profound psychological effect on Admiral Kurita. He believed he was engaging Halsey's fleet carriers, not mere escort carriers, and the aggressive destroyer attacks and constant air harassment convinced him he was facing a much larger force. The air was filled with smoke, rain squalls, and the confusion of battle. His force became disorganized. The Yamato was forced to turn away from a torpedo attack, taking it out of the action for a critical period and causing confusion in the Japanese line. American aircraft from the nearby Taffy 2 and Taffy 1 also joined the fight, adding to the pressure and the perception of a larger American presence. After 2.5 hours of intense combat and with his force scattered, his timetable for reaching Leyte Gulf completely disrupted and lacking clear information, Kurita made the controversial decision to break off the engagement. At 09:20, he ordered his ships to regroup to the north. The Taffy 3 units had suffered grievous losses. The escort carriers USS Gambier Bay, St. Lo, and USS Kalinin Bay were sunk, along with the destroyers Johnston and Hull, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, with over 1,000 men lost. But they had, against all odds and rational expectation, turned back the most powerful surface fleet Japan had sent to sea since the Battle of Midway. As the Battle of Samar reached its climax, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was engaging Admiral Ozawa's northern force in what would be known as the Battle off Cape Engano. The name Engano, meaning deception in Spanish, proved tragically apt for the Americans. Halsey's carriers launched massive, uninterrupted airstrikes against Ozawa's force, beginning in the morning of October 25th. The Japanese carriers, with their minimal and ineffective air groups, had little defense and could only maneuver violently. The carrier Chitose was sunk in the first wave of attacks. The carrier Zuikaku, the last veteran of the Pearl Harbor strike force, was hit by multiple torpedoes and bombs and sank later in the day, a symbolic end of the Imperial Navy's carrier aviation. The light carriers Zuiho and Chiyoda were also sunk. A destroyer was sunk, and other ships, including a light cruiser, were damaged. Ozawa's decoy mission was a complete tactical success. He had drawn Halsey's entire force away from Leyte Gulf. However, it came at the cost of the last of Japan's operational aircraft carriers, the very heart of its naval power projection. While this one-sided battle was underway, a series of increasingly frantic and desperate messages began to arrive at Halsey's flagship from Admiral Kinkaid and even from Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. The messages, some in plain language, detailed the dire situation off Samar and pleaded for immediate assistance from the fast battleships of Task Force 34. For hours, Halsey continued his pursuit of Ozawa, determined to finish off the Japanese carriers. Finally, under immense pressure and recognizing the grave threat to the invasion fleet, Halsey made a difficult decision. He detached a significant portion of his force, the fast battleships of Task Force 34, under Vice Admiral Willis Lee and one of his carrier groups, to steam south at high speed to intercept Kurita. However, this force would not arrive in the Samar area until after Kurita's center force had already disengaged and was withdrawing back through the San Bernardino Strait. The battle off Cape Engano concluded with the utter destruction of Ozawa's carrier force. The battle off Samar concluded with Kurita's retreat, a decision that has been debated by historians ever since. The final major action of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was the sinking of the American escort carrier USS St. Lo. Earlier in the day, as Taffy 3 was fighting for its life, a Japanese land-based air unit launched a coordinated attack using a new and terrifying tactic, the kamikaze, or divine wind. A Japanese aircraft deliberately crashed into the flight deck of the St. Lo. The impact and subsequent explosions of armed and fueled aircraft on her hangar deck caused massive internal damage and uncontrollable fires. The ship sank within 30 minutes, becoming the first major warship sunk solely by a kamikaze attack. This marked the first major success of an organized kamikaze campaign, which would become a defining and terrifying feature of the remaining months of the Pacific War, representing a shift to a form of warfare based on sacrificial attrition. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, a sprawling series of interconnected naval engagements fought between October 23 and 26, 1944, was the largest naval battle in history in terms of total ship tonnage and one of the most complex. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Showan plan had failed completely in its primary objective of destroying the American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. The cost of this failure was catastrophic and irreversible. Japan lost 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, along with hundreds of aircraft and, most critically, thousands of experienced sailors and the last of her veteran air crews. American losses, while painful, were far lighter in comparison. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and several smaller vessels. The human cost was even more lopsided, with Japanese casualties estimated at over 10 Igazuzerend, compared to about 3 Thasuzasons American. The battle had profound and irreversible strategic consequences. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. It would never again mount a major naval offensive or challenge American control of the Western Pacific. Its remaining heavy ships, starved of fuel and unable to risk sortying from their bases, were largely relegated to static defense or were sunk in port by subsequent American air raids. The American victory secured the beachhead at Leyte, allowing for the continued and difficult liberation of the Philippine archipelago. It also guaranteed the severing of Japan's logistical lines to the southern resources area, accelerating the strangulation of the Japanese war economy and war-making potential. The introduction of the kamikaze, while terrifying and causing significant Allied losses later, was a symptom of Japanese desperation and material inferiority, not a viable strategy for altering the course of the war. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the definitive naval battle of the Pacific War. It broke the back of the Japanese Empire's naval power in a way that previous victories like Midway and the Philippine Sea had not, as it destroyed the majority of the remaining Japanese surface fleet. It cemented American naval supremacy for the remainder of the war and beyond. The sea lanes were now open for the final direct advance toward the Japanese home islands, beginning with Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had struck the first blow at Pearl Harbor, was, for all strategic purposes, finished as a coherent fighting force after the 4 days of battle in and around the Philippines.